Hi, welcome to Storytelling Animals. I'm your host, Dayton Martindale. This is a Green New podcast where we use books to make sense of the ecological crisis. Today's guest is the author of a new book, The Book of Minds: How to Understand Ourselves and Other Beings from Animals to AI to Aliens. And the author of that is science writer Philip Ball. It's a great conversation that I had with Philip. It was really fun. It's a fun book. Consciousness has been something I've been interested in for a while now, but maybe a year and a half ago, decided to dig deeper, and I read a number of books about, theories of how consciousness could have arisen and when and how. And, I read books and articles and listened to podcasts from physicists, neuroscientists, philosophers, of course. And what struck me both is that it's a really interesting field and one where we really don't know the answers. And that's something that's refreshing about Philip's book, is that while he has his opinions and he shares some of them both in the book and here, he's also just exploring the range of ideas that people have about minds and consciousness. He's not necessarily, hawking his personal idea. So it's a really refreshing and fun conversation and a fun book to read, just to explore this range of ideas people have about something that really is mysterious. When I talk about consciousness and minds, what I'm asking is sort of why matter, which seems to be physical stuff, also, at least in some formations, at least in some life forms it seems, has thoughts and feelings and subjective experiences that go along with that. To me, that's just one of the great mysteries in the world, and it's also something with transcendent moral implications, because if we didn't have these feelings, then maybe it wouldn't really morally matter what we do to each other. But we do, and so figuring out what kinds of beings that we are and what kinds of beings other animals are, and potentially future AI or extraterrestrials you might encounter or whatever, but just knowing what kinds of beings that we are and the other creatures are helps us, I believe, to figure out how morally we interact with each other, and making our best guesses about what sorts of beings are sentient, are conscious, I think informs which beings that we should be most kind to morally. But I also think the fact that we don't really know leads me anyway to at least sort of a default respect for all life, for all creatures, perhaps for all matter, I'm inclined to use the phrase all creation, although my own views are secular, but just everything that is, I think, takes on just a bit more enchantment, or a bit more mystery, or a bit more dignity. I don't know what the right word is, to me anyway, because some of it became conscious, some of it came to think and feel, and I don't know. I'm rambling now, but I just kind of want to preface this conversation with that sort of moral background, because most of the conversation actually isn't about the ethics and morals of it all. It's more about what are our best guesses, how do we get there, how did nervous systems evolve, and it's really fascinating. I learned a lot from the book. I learned a lot from talking to Philip, and wish I could have talked with him even longer. But I will let you listen to him, hopefully with some sense of the moral import of it all, at least in the back of your minds. So, some quick housekeeping stuff before we get to the interview. If you enjoy this podcast, please like, subscribe, etc. I have a free weekly newsletter you can sign up for. There's a link for that in the show notes. You can also support this podcast financially at patreon.com/storytellingpod. That's patreon.com/storytellingpod. The lowest level there is $4 a month. That's basically roughly $1 an episode. I hope that at least some of you consider it, because I put a lot of time and effort into this podcast, and I wish I could put more time and effort, and I wish I could invest in a better website, a better audio, and stuff like that. I'm doing the best I can with the budget I have and with the time I have, and with your support, I can increase those. Without your support, frankly, this wouldn't be possible. If there were no supporters, I probably would have quit by now. We also have a podcast book club. The Storytelling Animals Book Club next meeting is Tuesday, August 23rd, to discuss As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock by Dina Julia Whitaker. It's a short book about Indigenous history of environmental justice, what environmental justice and injustice is meant for Indigenous people, and how environmentalists today, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, can learn from that and adopt that into our practices. I really just started it, page 2, but I'm excited about it. I think it's going to be really interesting and helpful, and I hope many of you join that conversation. You can join for free just by signing up for that free weekly newsletter. That gives you a free trial meeting of the book club. And then you can join on a more permanent basis, again, by supporting on Patreon at the Lore X tier, which is $7 a month. Roughly $2 an episode. Hopefully that's not too bad a deal. And you also get other perks like early access to episodes. You can ask me questions, and you can be in every meeting of the book club. August 23rd, As Long as Grass Grows. And then it's September, sometime in late September, I don't have the exact date set yet, we will be discussing Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, a science fiction classic about a near future California ravaged by climate change and other negative political consequences. It's a dark book in many ways, but there's hope in it too, and I'm really excited to discuss that with many of you as well. Yes, if you're interested in the book club, you can reach out to me with questions. You can go to daytonmartindale.com/book-club to keep track of the dates. You can join the weekly newsletter, or you can support on Patreon. These are all ways to get information about the book club. But you probably didn't click play on this episode because of the book club. You probably clicked play because you are curious about the Book of Minds. So here is Philip Ball. Hi, I'm here with Philip Ball, author of The Book of Minds. Philip, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Nice to join you.
Yeah. So you're a science writer. You've written a lot of books about different topics in science, everything from water to quantum mechanics. I'm interested how you got into minds and consciousness, and kind of specifically, did you get into it coming at it more from a science angle or a philosophy angle or a mix of both? Just how do you end up writing this book?
Well, there was a very particular path that this one took that began actually with AI. So some years ago, I was asked by a science magazine if I would look into writing an article about about some work that was trying to open up the black box of AI. So today's AI works pretty well on the whole, but we aren't always quite sure how it's working or how it's thinking, if you like. And this was an article that tried to get at that issue, and I wanted to sort of think more broadly about that, about the kind of mind that AI seemed to be. But I ran into trouble finding folks working on AI who could talk to that issue in a broad way, and I kind of sat on this piece for a while and didn't quite know what to do with it, and ended up not writing the article, but always sort of feeling that there was something there, something broader there to be excavated. And in particular, I was pointed in the direction of an article that was written in 1984 by a computer scientist at the University of Birmingham in England called Aaron Sloman. And his article was called The Structure of the Space of Possible Minds. And I really like this idea, the idea that there are a whole range of minds out there, of which, we're just one example, we humans. So other animals have minds of a sort. What kinds of minds are they? They're not all, they're not necessarily going to be like ours. AI could be thought of as having a kind of mind, and we can get, maybe talk a bit more about what that should mean. But somehow he had the idea that all these minds could be located in this space, this abstract space of some sort, that had coordinates that sort of define the different qualities of mind. So one might be intelligence, one might be consciousness, one might be memory. And I sat on this idea for a while, and I didn't quite know what to do with it. And then in 2019, I was asked to come as a visitor to Harvard Medical School for the summer, which was fantastic. So I went over there, and as I started sort of looking around the place, Harvard and MIT are real hotspots of research in cognition and AI and robotics and psychology. And they're starting to talk to each other. And I suddenly realized when I arrived that actually I hadn't written this article because it had to be a book. And it had to be a book that looked much more widely at what minds are and how to think about them. And, the funny thing is that things kind of fall into place sometimes when this happens. I went to visit someone at MIT in the media lab there. And I mentioned to him that I had written a piece recently about theories of consciousness. And he said, oh, okay, you're just the person we need to speak at this meeting we're having on animal cognition and animal communication. So come and give a 10-minute talk about consciousness. So I did that. And it was an amazing meeting. It was a fantastic meeting that brought together leading experts in animal cognition of all sorts. So people working on dolphins, on primates, on birds, on octopuses. And it was a great place to learn very quickly, what was known and what was being researched about animal cognition. And of course, this fitted perfectly with what I decided to do. And so the whole area of, animal minds was kind of opened up for me at this meeting. And I was able to speak to various people about that. So that's really where the book grew out of. And I started writing it while I was at Harvard. And this is what it became, the Book of Minds.
Yeah, so early on in the book, you define, or you take a first stab at least at defining mind. And basically what you come down is that any entity with the mind is an entity that there is something it is like to be that thing. So if there's something it is like to be you or me or a bird or an octopus, then we have a mind. And if we don't think there's something that's like to be a rock, for instance, then we wouldn't necessarily say that a rock has a mind. But you raise in this idea of the space of possible minds that there are, traits that, an AI might have intelligence to be good at chess, and that might be in the space of possible minds without giving it really a mind, if that makes sense. So how do you even think about which of these traits are actually important and relevant to having, something that's like to having something inner experience going on?
Yeah, well, that is a really difficult question that, quite frankly, we don't know the answer to at the moment. This definition that I use of how, what is a mind, it's not a rigorous one. There is no rigorous definition. There's no scientific definition or philosophical definition that everyone agrees on. So this was a kind of rough and ready way of getting into the subject. So this notion that if we're going to say that something genuinely has a mind, there is some kind of experience that entity has. So, I don't think, and I think most people working in computer science would agree, I don't think that my laptop, there's nothing it is like to be my laptop. It's a bunch of silicon circuits, and that's all. Whereas, if we talk about, a mouse or a bat or a fish, or maybe even, a spider, maybe even a bacterium, who knows? There may be something it is like to be those entities. But really what I wanted to do with this idea of a space of possible minds is to kind of get away from any notion of drawing a hard and fast barrier and saying everything on this side has a mind, everything on this side doesn't. Because I don't think that's how minds are. I think they are matters of degree, and there are, at the moment, there are quite fierce arguments happening within biology about where you draw that line. There are some biologists who argue that we need to think about plants as having some kind of mind. Others say that perhaps everything that is alive has a kind of mind, almost by definition, that that's a part of what life is. And what I think the advantage of having this notion of a space of possible minds gives you is that you don't have to worry too much about that. Everything can be put on there. You can put a brick in that space. It's probably at 0 in every dimension of mind, okay? But, you can put it there. A computer, I don't think as I say, I don't think any computers today have experience. So in a sense, they don't have minds, but they certainly do some things of the sort that minds do. They have a kind of intelligence. They can do computation. They can solve problems. So they have some of the attributes that this space of possible minds recognizes, even if it's not a mind as such. And so we can start to make a comparison between anything that has a kind of, you might say, a computational, you might say a cognitive ability of some sort. We can start to make this comparison without getting too bogged down in definitions of what a mind is and whether something does or doesn't have one.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I want to get into, plants and other forms of life later, and your computer as well. But maybe let's start with ourselves and other animals, which maybe have the types of minds that are connected to neurons and brains that we are most familiar with. So one thing I appreciate in your book is it walks this line between definitely, acknowledging certain impressive and particular features of the human mind, as are unique to that human mind, while also not just, casting other animal minds as just sort of deficient versions of that human mind. The space of possible mind kind of can give everything its own space that is kind of equally or at least similarly interesting, without having to cast it as just sort of a one-dimensional ladder of mind or something. So how did you how did your research on this book affect how you thought about kind of the similarities, the differences between human minds and other animals?
Well, that was something that struck me quite quickly as I started to look into research that had been done on animal cognition, how important it was to get away from this notion that has been around, for eons, really, sort of going back at least to the ancient Greeks, that, somehow we are the pinnacle of mindedness and that we measure everything in comparison to how closely it approaches us. I think that this has certainly been a tendency until quite recent times, when we've started to be able to really get some handle on the kinds of experiences and cognitive abilities that other animals in particular have. And I think that has given people who research them a real appreciation that there is this diversity and that we're just one representative amongst many. Now, I think it's fair to say, and it's not a boast on the part of the human species, I think it's fair to say that there is something special about the human mind. But what is it? Because, it's not... In a sense, it's not problem-solving ability, for example. Other animals can solve impressive problems. It's not memory. Some other animals have absolutely prodigious memories. It's not. We can find examples in the animal kingdom of creatures that can do things that we're nowhere near. Some birds can navigate by the Earth's magnetic field. In some sense, we don't know quite what this means to the bird, but it's almost as though they can see on the sky, a kind of an impression of the magnetic field that they can use to guide them. There are abilities that other animals have that we don't have, cognitive abilities. So what is it that's special about the human mind, if anything? And I suspect that it's not just what I suspect. I think this is what sort of comes out from behavioral studies, that we seem in particular to have an amazing versatility, an amazing ability to generalize our cognitive abilities. So a lot of animals have a highly advanced cognition in a very narrow range. They can do certain things very well, but other things, really not at all. So there are some birds, for example, that have fantastic memories for where they've hidden food. But, they're not able to generalize that memory to kind of, memorize a scene that they've seen, or to memorize a page of text or something. Whereas, we seem able to really use our cognitive abilities across different areas. We can generalize them. Added to that, we seem able, and perhaps it's not independent from that, we have an incredible ability in communication, in social communication, and in particular, of course, we have language. And the one idea that I explored in the book is that language, which only humans have, in the sense that we really mean language, so not just communication, but actually doing things that we do with language, it doesn't seem to be simply about a kind of more sophisticated sort of communication that animals have for sending out warning signals, or for, giving mating calls or whatever. What we do with language is, it's almost like a kind of mind projection. By using language, we are able to project our experience, to communicate our experience to one another. And we often do that with narrative and with story. If we tell a story to someone else, they can imagine themselves in that picture. And I think that's most probably something that a dog, for example, is unable to do. Even if you could somehow communicate something to a dog, there's no indication that it would have the mental ability to, in a sense, project itself into different times, different places, different personalities. So we're really talking here about, I think, about the imagination. And, one thing I suggest in the book is that maybe it's in our imaginative capacities that human beings seem to have something special, and that language, in fact, I draw on the work of the linguist Daniel Dorr, who suggested that language is actually there for the education of the imagination. And I think that's a lovely, but also a very resonant idea.
Mm-hmm. I do want to at least sort of raise a slight pushback is maybe too strong, but just kind of I had an interview a few weeks ago with David M. Pena Guzman, who wrote a book about animal dreaming, and one of the things we talked about was this idea of whether other animals might have imagination. And I think, even while you were talking, I'm wondering in my mind, like, does a bee who does a waggle dance to show, where the nectar is, like, do the other bees who see the waggle dance, does anything happen in their minds to, like, put them in that location? Or when my dog sees a tennis ball, does anything happen to sort of put him outside? Or, and so one of the sort of more simpler but interesting examples in that book about animal dreaming was a chimpanzee who took kind of a picture of a banana on a page and pretended to eat it. And just even, it sounds not that remarkable, but Pena Guzman's argument was sort of that there's a projection that needs to be done there of understanding that it's a representation of banana and that it's not a real banana, and interacting with it. And I think that I think, which is true to what you say in the book, that all these things you're saying aren't necessarily like a deep line in the sand. But I also agree with you that sort of there are, particular capabilities of human language and imagination that, so far as we can tell, do really seem to be unique and special.
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely agree with all of that. I think, none of these cognitive abilities that we have came out of nowhere. And our imagination, such as it is, will have. I think it's very likely that we will be able to see echoes of that certainly in close closely related species to us. So yeah, I totally agree. And I think in particular, it used to be thought, for example, that animals just inhabited a perpetual present. They had no sense of the past, no sense of the future. I think there's good evidence now that that is not the case. And I mean, dreaming is actually one of them. That, there have been studies that have shown that when some animals, I think it was rats maybe, but maybe the same applies to dogs, I'm sure it does, when they're asleep, they seem to be activating patterns of mental activity that recapitulate things they've experienced recently, even to the extent of their sort of muscles twitching. And anyway, I guess anyone who's seen a dog sleep and, make noises in their sleep, and, must be aware that they're experiencing something. And it does seem that they, like us, during sleep, quite possibly have a kind of mental playback of what's happened, maybe just what's happened during the day, that is part of somehow the mind processing that information. And there's also evidence that that animals can think ahead, can imagine the future. For example, I mentioned how some birds are very good at remembering where they've stored food. There are some experiments done on scrub jays, which scrub jays are are one of the experts in this sort of food caching ability, as it's called. And so they can have a fantastic memory for where they've hidden everything, and they hide it very kind of systematically. They seem to be conscious of whether they're being observed and whether other birds are likely to steal it, and they make accommodation for that. But I think in particular there's an experiment that showed that if they're allowed to hide food for the next morning, and they know, because they've been sort of trained in this way, to know that there's a chance that they might end up being put in a cage where there's not going to be any food there, if you like, for breakfast the next morning, they'll choose to hide it in that cage rather than in any other. As if they're kind of saying, well, look, I might end up in here. And if I do, I'm going to be hungry in the morning. So I'm going to need to have some food here. So, clearly something is going on that involves an element of future planning that seems to involve not just something automated, but a kind of, as though they are creating a future, as though they are imagining a future scenario in their minds that they're allowing for. So I absolutely agree. There are elements of what goes into human imagination that I think we can find in other animals too.
Mm-hmm. I think something you said at the beginning of that is that, our mind capabilities don't come out of nowhere. They were all sort of evolved through processes that were shared with many of these other creatures. And there's a section maybe halfway through your book that the title of the subsection is How Minds Began, and it's about at least how we, our best guess maybe, I take it to be sort of the story you find most plausible about the origins of consciousness and subjective experience, at least on this planet. And, as you mentioned earlier, some people have different stories about where minds began, which we can maybe get to later. But what is this story of, a few 100 million years ago, early in animal life, of how some people think minds began?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true that this is kind of informed guesswork. But the one idea is that it's really a story. This much is a story about the origin of nervous systems, and it seems quite likely that nerve cells were evolved in order to be able to transmit signals over long distances through animal bodies. So there's something that will have become necessary quite early on when life became multicellular, when cells started to gather into larger bodies that had to move around, and they needed to coordinate limbs or some kind of body movements or something in order to move through water. They also needed to start having sensory equipment, to eyes, for example, to both to find food and to avoid predators. So these were two separate things that were needed by multicellular animals. That you need a sensory sort of apparatus, and you need to be able to coordinate movement. And there's no reason why those two things have to be done together. But what they do seem to need is coordination between different parts of the body, and so that's what nerves do. So they're, long, thin cells that can send electrical impulses down them from one place to a distant place. So they're able to allow cells and tissues to coordinate their activity. So this was the idea that, the nervous systems began this way. And eventually, those two systems might have been quite separate to begin with, but eventually they were integrated so that what the animal sensed, was able to be transmitted instantly into some kind of action, into some kind of movement or behavior that was, like chasing after a prey or avoiding a predator or whatever. So this seems to have happened very, very early on in the evolution of larger animals. So before the Cambrian explosion, that was about 540 million years ago. So we're looking further back than that, about sort of 600, 700 million years ago, when the animals that existed there were more. Some of them were a bit like sponges. They were very kind of simple. They didn't, they didn't have well-formed, well-shaped bodies. That was something that tended to come much more during the Cambrian era. But they were able to move and coordinate in this way. What happened around that time? It was back then, before the Cambrian, that what the kind of evolutionary branch, if you like, that became vertebrates, that became animals with backbones, fish and reptiles and mammals, and eventually us, diverged from the lineage that became mollusks, such as octopuses and squid. So this was about 600 million years ago, and the common ancestor they shared was it was probably something like a little sort of flatworm, a very simple creature with a very simple nervous system that would probably have been used for sensing and for movement, but we don't know to what extent those would have been integrated together. And what seems to have happened is that those two kinds of nervous system that led to ultimately to different kinds of mind, they evolved on separate branches. So the kind of nervous system that we see in octopuses, for example, is very different to ours. There are some similarities, so there was some sort of evolution that was shared between them, but in some ways it's very different. I mean, shall I say more about how octopuses differ?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay. Well, I mean, the main difference is that for us, we have a central brain that coordinates everything, and in a sense, it sort of controls the body. The body gives it feedback as well and affects how the brain operates. But the brain is kind of the control center, really. For octopuses, they do also have a kind of central brain in their head. It's a brain that looks very different to ours. It doesn't have these two hemispheres. It just has a large number, dozens of lobes that just do various things. And it has a kind of hole in the middle where its esophagus goes through. So its feeding tube goes right through the middle of the head and through the brain. So it's a very weird, very different sort of anatomy. But most of the neurons in the octopus, so over 50% of them, are in the body. It has about as many neurons as a dog does, but they're distributed in this completely different way. And so a lot of those neurons are in the arms, and they control what the arm does. And the arms have little clusters of neurons that are almost like sort of little proto-brains for each arm. And they seem to have a degree of autonomy. They can, if you like, they can think for themselves. They certainly seem to have their own sort of memory. So it seems that there are certainly times in an octopus's life where the arms are being controlled independently from the central brain. It's as though they're sort of separate creatures that are just going about doing their own thing, and the brain, if you like, and the eye of the octopus is just kind of watching the arms do their stuff, not necessarily knowing what they're going to do. But then, at other times, the brain does seem able to send top-down information to control what the whole body is doing. So they have a very different way of organising their cognition. And some researchers have suggested that it's not even clear that this creates a kind of unified consciousness, that perhaps octopuses and squid have a more fragmented consciousness, maybe even two separate consciousnesses that sometimes kind of merge and sometimes go their own way. Whichever it is, it's very, very hard for us to imagine ourselves into the kind of experience that an octopus might have, compared to how we might try to do that for a cat or for a mouse or something.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that, like, some combination of needing to move through the world and have a sense of your own body and sense your surroundings. How is what animals do different than, for instance, like a self-driving car or a robot like a Roomba? I don't actually know how advanced Roombas are, but if you want to compare it even to something more advanced than a Roomba, go ahead. But just because I think, like the story you're telling, like, it's very intuitive to me that, yes, an octopus looks like it's a thinking, feeling creature, and my computer doesn't. But sometimes I don't know whether that's just intuition or what it's actually grounded in. So what is different about synthetic systems?
Yeah, well, I mean, our intuition is becoming an ever less reliable guide for this. When you see some of the robots that now exist and they move, in such an uncannily kind of human or animal-like way, we start to imagine that there has to be something going on inside them. Although, as I say, as far as we know, that there isn't. And that difference is what we think of as sentience, really, or as consciousness. So sentience is often the word that would be preferred for simpler animals or simpler organisms generally, as a kind of feeling, some kind of experience. And why is that? Why is there that difference? And it's a good question to which we don't know the answer, because it would seem as though, as you say, it would be a perfectly good evolutionary answer to the question of, how to coordinate movement and sensing and behavior and so on, that you could make, a nervous system that did all of that stuff without having any kind of inner experience. It just did the sort of processing in the same way as a computer does. So, why add sentience or consciousness to that? And the truth is, we just don't know. There is still a discussion about whether there's any adaptive benefit to consciousness at all. It's kind of hard to imagine how there wouldn't be, because it seems, certainly such a central part of our experience. And now I think there are good reasons, at least, to suspect that other animals have consciousness. It's just if you like, it's a more economical way of explaining their behavior, that it looks so much like some of the things that we do that it just seems kind of weird to imagine that, well, they will just be doing this stuff that looks the same, but they're actually doing it in a completely different cognitive way that has no awareness. At some point it's easier to just assume they have the awareness that we have that is guiding the behavior. But why is really still an open question. There are some who say, well, it's something that just is going to emerge when you have this sort of integration of all these different functions that the nervous system has. That in a sense where it perhaps comes from is it's the result of opening up to the environment, if you like, to allowing information from the environment to come in and affect the internal state of that organism, and in particular to affect it in a way where the organism is then coming up with a behavior that is optimal, or that it hopes is optimal for its survival. When it does that, what it's effectively doing is making some evaluation, if you like, some value judgment about the environment. Is this environment hurting me, or is it a good place to be? Should I get out of here, or should I go over there and investigate and see if I can find food? Those things, the argument is that those activities will be enhanced by some kind of awareness, some kind of experience that has a valence that is either, if you like, crudely speaking, good or bad. If it's, if it feels good, then we'll go on doing it. If it feels bad, we'll stop and try to find another solution. And, but by creating that kind of sensation, the organism acquires a sort of motivation to behave in a certain way that something like a Roomba doesn't have. It's simply programmed, if you like, to do certain things and to make, to make decisions. Should I, keep going in this direction or not? But it's a much more programmatic thing than an organism that is in an environment where it just doesn't know what it's going to experience, what it's going to come up against. It doesn't know what its objective is, even, other than perhaps to survive. But, what does that mean? What do we have to do to survive? So it may be that experience, if you like, or sentience is something that comes about from a cognitive system that has to make those kinds of open-ended decisions and those value judgments about an environment, that rather than everything coming down to a simple yes or no answer, it has to come down to something like, well, how do I feel about this? Do I feel good or bad? And if I feel, how do I kind of intuit that I should behave? That's a very anthropomorphic way of putting it, but you see what I mean, that a sensation, a feeling, gives a much more versatile, open-ended way of behaving and finding behaviors than we find in AI and computer systems.
I think I was going to ask about this later, but I think I'll ask now because I now I'm an environmental journalist, but a few years ago, as an undergraduate, I studied astrophysics, and I was really into physics and math, and kind of adapted this view of the world in which there's fundamental particles and fields and forces, and these are ultimately what these are inviolable, and ultimately explain why anything does what it does. And so if you'd asked me a few years ago, I think I would have said something like, how can consciousness even have an evolutionary role? Like, how can consciousness ultimately affect what the matter bits, I guess, are doing, because they're just evolving according to physical laws? What role could our thoughts and feelings play in that? And I think I've grown dissatisfied with that worldview, but I'm also I think it's hard to break. So you kind of toward the end of the book have a chapter about free will and maybe this idea that actually our conscious decisions and choices do impact what we do, which when I say it out loud maybe sounds obvious, like of course they do, because that's our lived experience, that why else would we have them, like what you're saying. But I think maybe it's worth unpacking, like how can our sort of nebulous thoughts and feelings impact seemingly harder and more more structured matter.
Yeah, and this is an argument that I felt I did need to get into. I should say, first of all, that we talk about it. I mean, this term free will is the one that we've inherited from previous centuries of philosophy of mind, which is unfortunate because it's a terrible term, because you have to ask, first of all, well, free of what? We're not totally free. We're not free from our past history. We're not free actually from the influence. It's very clear that our genes are influence our behaviors. That's absolutely clear. So, that's something we're kind of born with, if you like, to some extent. So, in some sense, there's no action is totally free. And then this notion of will is a kind of, it sounds kind of mystical, like it's a kind of mysterious power that operates and moves things around, in addition to the physical forces that we know about, the four basic forces of nature. So it invites misinterpretations, but it's what we have. And really what I'm talking about here is the capacity, and this is what neuroscientists talk about these days, the capacity for volitional decision making, for making decisions that, if you like, didn't have to be that way. And the argument you've talked about, I mean, the common objection to this, as you say, is that, okay, if we break everything, you can break everything down into atoms and forces between them. There's no free will in that. It's completely deterministic. Aside from sort of quantum randomness, it's deterministic that if these atoms are in this configuration, they're going to do X next. They can't just suddenly decide for themselves to go off into a completely different way. So I completely understand that argument, but I don't think that the two are at all incompatible. And the key here is thinking about what causes something to happen. It's about causation. And I say in the book, there are now very good reasons, hard scientific reasons, to think that causation isn't something that just flows upwards from the atoms. It's something that can appear at different levels in a complex system, certainly a system as complex as we are, and that there can be more causation for things happening at higher levels than at lower levels. This is something that it seems very clear now from studies of causation and the mathematics of complex systems that it's something that can happen. And in a sense, we kind of know, as you say, we kind of know this is true already. The idea of, well, how can the mind affect matter? How can mind move matter? Well, I'm just raising my teacup that I have here. And there it is. My mind has done it. And you could say, well, what happened there was actually that the electrons in the atoms of your finger were repelling the electrons in the atoms of the coffee cup's handle, and so but what made those atoms do that? I mean, where is the causation in there? And you can say, well, let's look into your neurons, and then you can, look into the cell membranes where ions are coming through ion channels. And if you go far enough down, you've lost it. You've lost the question entirely. You've lost any sense of causation. You will never find it down there. You will only be able to tell a causative story about that process of me raising my coffee cup at the right level of the system. And that right level is the decision-making circuits in neural circuits in my brain. That's where we have to look. How do they work? So that's really what I'm arguing for in the book, that if we are talking about decision-making and volition, that's where we have to start. If we take it apart further into atoms, we've lost it. We've lost the question. It's similar. I mean, it's kind of trivial, but it's importantly trivial. If you're talking about, well, how did the ball game that we saw at the weekend, why did it win? I mean, being British, I think more in terms of soccer, and if we think, well, why did that team beat the other team? If we try to get an atomic level quantum mechanical description of that process, it's not just that it's too complicated, it is that it is void of all causative, explanatory potential. There is just none there at that level. We have to look at it. We have to ask that question at the right level. So that's really what I'm talking about as free will, that it's best understood as a neural process of decision making that we can then ask questions about. What are the circuits in our mind that are involved in volition? How do they decide given a particular stimulus? How do they decide what to do? It's very clear if we look at animal behavior that there is a randomness to that. That, for example, if you give an animal a stimulus that is identical as far as you can make it, the animal won't necessarily do the same thing each time. And, determinists might say, yeah, but if we looked at the fine details, then we might find that this atom, moved this way this time and that way the other time. But the fact is that that level of detail is invisible to the creature. It's invisible to the decision-making process. Evolution, can't handle that level of graininess. So it's irrelevant to the problem. So there is, a degree of randomness in behavior that is part of what is drawn on when we think about where volition comes from.
Yeah, and I think that maybe gets at what, maybe another difference between life and artificial systems we've created, because it's we know how I keep using a Roomba, forgive me, but we know how a Roomba works, or even if I don't know how my computer works, someone knows. But you bring up in the book that kind of even one of the simplest nervous systems in the animal kingdom, which has something like 200 neurons, we still don't exactly even know how the feedback and interactions between those neurons work. That it's kind of a seemingly a higher level of complication. But what you said you started even the whole book idea about is that we don't even always understand everything that goes on within current artificial intelligence. There was a big article a few weeks ago, a discourse around, some Google engineer, I think, thought that one of the Google AIs had achieved consciousness, but you and I think many people think this is pretty unlikely. We've talked about some of what you see as the differences between artificial system like your laptop and an octopus, but why I want to maybe drill into it because all of these questions that we're asking really do have strong ethical implications. I think, if an AI can think and feel and have good, pleasure and pain or whatever else, more complicated feelings, whatever, that should anyway really change how we would interact. And obviously that's true with animals and, potentially plants or whatever as well. But anyway, why do you think it seems so unlikely that contemporary AI and even most likely near future AI along the same lines of how we build it now is so unlikely to actually have that sentience?
Well, I think, first of all, I think we have to start by admitting that because we don't understand what consciousness is, let alone have good ways of looking for it in animals, that we have to allow some uncertainty there. But having said that, I do feel absolutely confident that today's AI doesn't have sentience, and part of the reason for that is that, as you say, we know how it works. We know what it's doing, and what it's doing is completely different from the way we work. That this AI that the Google engineer was talking about, it's basically a kind of chatbot, or it's a general sort of software to develop chatbots. So what it does is it just mines information out there, on the World Wide Web, all the documents it can access, to find most probable responses to any questions that we give it. And it's so efficient and so good at doing this that it can really sound pretty alarmingly convincing at times. But that is all it is doing. And we know that is all it's doing because that's how we've built it. So there is no reason to suspect that in that, it is basically just like looking up a filing system, only just faster and with more data. So we don't imagine that somehow if we look up an answer in a filing system, there has been some cognition in that filing cabinet has given us the answer. it's just there and it's just been looked up. That is all the AI is doing in this case, but it's just doing it extraordinarily well. So it's just a probabilistic process. You know, what's the most probable? What's the most probable set of words the AI is kind of, you know, if you like, saying to itself, I can put together in response to this query. It's a simple sort of input-output thing, and we know that there's no, you know, real, if you like, real sort of intelligence, deeper intelligence behind that, because of some of the incredibly seemingly dumb things that systems like that still do. That, you know, occasionally, I mean, if you ask an AI like that to develop some text, to write some prose, you know, some of it is kind of weird and spooky and, you know, slightly sort of hallucinogenic in the things it comes up with. But, you know, within that, we can see that there's no kind of sense of a coherent story, you know, of that we would have of how things should go. It just kind of drifts. It's just like a word soup that is, you know, vaguely coherent. And that's all we can hope for at the moment from these systems. And if they get better and better, you know, all the better. But that doesn't mean they're getting more, you know, they're getting closer and closer to sentience. They're just doing the same thing faster and with more data. So there's no reason to imagine that these systems are even going in the direction of sentience at the moment. It's not something that anyone really seems to think will just fall out of a system once it's big enough, once that you stick enough transistors on the silicon chip. You're going to, it seems likely that it's going to, if we're going to get anything like sentience from one of these systems, we're going to need to understand what consciousness is, first of all, and then to build it in. And there are theories, there are too many theories in a way for how human consciousness arises, but none of them are theories that are reflected in the architecture of today's computer circuits. So that's really the basis of my confidence about this, that, you know, we're not, as far as I can see, AI isn't even heading in the right direction towards consciousness and towards human-like cognition. And some people, in fact, quite a lot of people now working on AI think that if it's going to get better, and in particular, if it's going to display anything like the sort of common sense that we just take for granted, but that is notably lacking from AI at the moment, then we're probably going to have to build that in by hand rather than just imagining it's going to fall out of the complex circuitry.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can last couple questions go back to living organisms. You know, we told the story earlier about the evolution of the nervous system, and I do think that this is to many maybe the most intuitive proxy for consciousness that we have, but as you mentioned, there are a lot of people who think consciousness might arise earlier. There are some who would argue that it arises later. So can you maybe let's start with earlier. Can you kind of walk us just through the different views people have about, I guess, either panpsychism or biopsychism would be the two terms, sort of consciousness is everywhere or consciousness is in all living things?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, above that, there's another level, as we said, where some people think that plants might have a kind of sentience. And the idea there, and this relates to biopsychism, the idea there is that our own consciousness it seems to arise somehow in a way we don't understand from electrical signaling between neurons. Now, electrical signaling isn't specific to neurons. Lots of cells, in fact, pretty much all cells really can create differences in electrical potential across their membranes by letting ions, charged atoms, in and out of across the membrane, and they can communicate with each other that way. And this happens in tissues, in ordinary tissues. It happens in some of our tissues, that there's electrical communication going on. I mean, there's electrical communication behind the heartbeat, for example. There are coherent waves of electrical activity going through the heart, which cause muscle contraction. So it's a general property of cells. And, you know, I can certainly see the case, even though if I'm not yet entirely persuaded by it, that something like that, we know that it happens in plants, something like that perhaps could give rise to, a kind of sentience, a kind of proto-feeling in plants. But, going back even more, as I say, pretty much any cell can do this. Bacteria, they let things go back and forth across their membrane. They can communicate with one another. They often do that, not so much electrically, but by giving out chemical signals that, a bit like pheromones, really, that the other bacteria can sense and respond to. So there's certainly communication there. But the idea of biopsychism is that, even the simplest systems, like single cells, the simplest living systems that we know about, by virtue of having this interactive communication, if you like, with its environment, that there is something there that is that gives rise to a kind of vague buzz of feeling that is, really the beginnings, the first glimmer of sentience. So that's the biopsychist argument, that actually, in a sense, all experience, including our own consciousness, arises from kind of atoms of sentience, which are which are individual cells with this sort of interaction with its environment. But there are some who say, well, even that, it still doesn't really explain where this sentience comes from. Maybe we just have to put it in as a kind of fundamental property of nature, of the physical world. So this is panpsychism, the idea that every entity has some degree of consciousness, even atoms, that it's just a fundamental property of the universe, in the same sense as electrical charges, or as, the gravitational forces. And that's where we need to look for an explanation of it. And it's interesting that, this used to be an idea that was sort of mooted, 100, 200 years ago. People like Henri Bergson had this idea, the philosopher. And then it sort of fell out of favour, and neuroscience came along and genetics came along. But now it's become kind of more respectable, for philosophers at least, to talk about panpsychism again. And there are some theories of consciousness that invoke something like panpsychism. So I'm interested that it's, it's something that is at least tolerated now. Again, I don't know that I buy it. It seems to me to be sort of deferring the question indefinitely. But I'm interested that it's being talked about again.
Mm-hmm. I think that it is the fact that I don't know how to refute it, or really refute any of this. I think has kind of made me more open to any idea, or just exploring it. But I think what's useful maybe about the space of possible minds is that maybe we can, even if we say, here are things about bacteria, like maybe some of those correlate with mindedness, that we also can say, but there are, if there's something it is like to be bacteria, there's probably something different it is like to be a parrot, or a trout or something. So I think, gosh, we're approaching an hour, and I'm not going to get through all my questions. But you include, I think, kind of some more speculative types of minds that you explore. I think in one direction that might be whether, we can talk of a whole forest or civilization or the earth itself as having a mind. In another direction, you talk about, what the mind of God might mean or even look like. You also have a chapter that's a lot about, aliens, extraterrestrials, and kind of what their minds might be like. I really enjoyed all those sections, and I'm kind of wondering, I think, animals and AI are maybe kind of the more obvious places to look. What was your motivation for kind of looking in less expected places for minds?
Well, I was interested to see how far we could push this, because, as we say, if we have a space of possible minds, we can put anything in there pretty much. So, let's see where we can take it. And I think in particular, in thinking about aliens, I've long felt that the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, as it's called, is kind of predicated on the idea that these aliens we're looking for are going to be a bit like us, only they're probably going to have better technology. And that's not impossible, but it seems to me to be a very limited way to be thinking about what minds might be. That, you know, if they have evolved through Darwinian evolution, and there's even an argument, you know, there's an argument about whether that is the only way for complex organisms, complex entities that might be minded to evolve. But, you know, if they have, on a very different environment, there's a lot of chance involved in how evolution goes. You know, they might have ended up somewhere entirely different. Or, you know, if there are general principles to Darwinian evolution, which there kind of are, you can see that there are, you know, that it finds the same solution at different times in different places because it just happens to be the best, you know, physical solution. So maybe there's some convergence. Maybe the alien minds evolved by Darwinian natural selection would actually share some similarities with ours. So I, you know, wanted to talk about those possibilities, but I did want to try to create a bit more broad-mindedness about what minds, you know, could be and what they might look like and how they might divide the universe up. There's this kind of automatic assumption, I think, very often amongst scientists, in particular amongst physicists, that the laws of nature that we see and that we've deduced, I mean, we know that they apply pretty much everywhere in the universe, but that doesn't mean, I think, to say that all other intelligent entities will have formulated them in exactly the same way, will have carved nature up at the same joints. So let's, you know, try and be more open-minded about that, and not assume that, you know, we're looking for civilizations that do the same kinds of things as we do, you know, but just with better technology. But looking even further afield, you know, I kind of thought, well, this idea crops up, the mind of God. You know, we hear it sort of casually used. It was famously casually used by Stephen Hawking in A Brief History of Time at the end. And, you know, physicists use it almost to sort of suggest, you know, the mind of God is what created the laws of physics. So I wanted to ask, you know, what can we say about that? And I guess I felt like it feels like a bit of a killjoy thing to say, but I think the only respectful way we can talk about that is to take seriously what theologians have said about what God is like. And, you know, often the God of monotheistic religions, but not even just necessarily that. And if we do that, then sadly we have to get away from this kind of anthropomorphized God that, you know, sits around and decides to create the universe and, you know, does so in 7 days, and, you know, that it, according to the Old Testament, is kind of jealous of other gods. And, you know, this isn't really what the deepest thinkers, certainly in the Christian tradition, and I think more generally, have thought about as what, you know, God actually is. And I had to come to the conclusion that if we take seriously, you know, what that theological position is, we can't really talk about the mind of God at all. Because that sort of God isn't the kind of thing that has minds. Minds have purposes in the universe. You know, they have reasons for doing the things that they do. Those aren't things that we can talk about or think about if we think about something like the mind of God. So sadly, I think the mind of God is actually one of the few things I don't think I could find a place for in the space of possible minds.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're at about an hour, so I just want to maybe have one more question if you got time.
Sure, yeah.
Is just kind of what is... So you've done all this research. There are all these people with different ideas of how minds arose, what consciousness is for. You have, you know, panpsychists, biopsychists, people who think animals alone are conscious. You know, there are people, we didn't get into it, and I don't think we need to, but who I think would put, you know, consciousness evolution even later, you know, even as late as human language. You know, some philosophers might say that consciousness has yet to evolve. It's all an illusion. But and then you also go through all these different theories about what it's for, and what to you are kind of the most promising directions for like what's the most promising research or directions or philosophizing or neuroscienceizing that will help us understand more about this and help us refine our best guesses. Like, I guess just what's the most promising directions of ideas or research in the field to you after doing all this research?
Well, I do think that the dialogue that's now happening in very different areas between people working on animal cognition and AI and child psychology, I think that is something that's relatively recent and that is becoming extremely fertile, in particular in helping us think about our own minds. What are the algorithms that our minds actually use? In terms of understanding consciousness, to be honest, I don't see any imminent breakthrough in that area. And I think part of the reason for that is that it's so hard to bring those theories into the arena of testable ideas, testable in the sense of being falsifiable. It's very hard for any of those theories to sort of say, well, we predict X, and if X is not the case experimentally, then this theory is wrong. I don't think there's a single theory of consciousness where that has yet happened. And, even if they make a prediction and it's not true, it seems that what generally happens is people say, well, there's a bit of wiggle room here, and, maybe we just have to tweak the theory a bit. So I think we're going to be waiting for some time before we can, if ever, start to rule out theories of consciousness and narrow down the field. But I think that one of the things that that I do see actually starting to happen there is to have a more nuanced view of what consciousness is, because I think that what we'll actually find is that in this space of possible minds, consciousness isn't just a single axis, a single dimension or variable, that actually there's more than one mode of consciousness. And already animal researchers are starting to suggest this, that what consciousness might mean for, a rabbit, or certainly for a bird, could be something quite different to what it means for us. It's not just that the bird has, some of it, but less than us. It actually has a different kind of mode of consciousness in some respects. And I think we're going to have to start taking seriously the possibility that actually the machines we're making may eventually have a kind of consciousness, but that it won't necessarily be just like ours, and maybe not like ours at all. So I think that this kind of broadening of how we think about consciousness, and stopping thinking of it as a single thing and thinking of it as perhaps itself a multi-dimensional entity or property, I think that that's already starting to happen. And I think that maybe that will be more productive in helping us think about consciousness, just as I've tried to do about minds generally, rather than saying, either something has a mind or it doesn't. We might start to be able to say, well, it has this kind of attribute of consciousness, but maybe not so much this one. And so, we'll start to see that the question of is X conscious or not is actually not the right question. We can break it down into smaller questions that we can make progress on.
Well, yeah, thanks for that. I think that's a useful answer. And is there anything else that you want to add about any of this that we've missed?
You covered the book pretty comprehensively, actually, Dayton. So I don't think, no, I can't immediately think of anything.
Well, listeners, I promise there is a lot more in the book on all of this. This was, I think, a nice taste of most of what's in there, though. So yeah, the book is The Book of Minds by Philip Ball. I'll put a link in the episode description. And Philip, thanks so much for coming on the show.
That was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. I want to add 2 quick notes on that conversation. The first is that the creature with 200 neurons that I referred to is C. elegans, a tiny roundworm that actually has 302 neurons. So my apologies to C. elegans for the undercount. And the second note I wanted to make is just about, that discussion of human language and imaginative capacity. I know non-human capacity for language was something that came up in my previous solo episode about Talk to Me by T.C. Boyle, where we talked about chimpanzees and sign language. And I think my own instincts are always to be skeptical of anyone claiming a major difference between humans and non-human animals, because so often the people who claim those differences end up getting proven wrong. And because sometimes those differences are used to justify oppression, which makes you skeptical. But on the other hand, I will say, humans are allowed to be special in some ways. Just like if I think chimpanzees are special, or if I think, the mantis shrimp is special, or a particular plant is special, you're allowed to think there are special things about humans too. And maybe one of those special things is the degree to which our language and imaginative capacities might be, be able to let us pretend to be Hamlet or tell certain types of stories that other animals might not have. But with the caution that there's much we don't understand about other animal communication, and maybe we'll be proven to be right, maybe we'll be proven wrong, maybe we'll never know. I don't know, but I guess just the ideas I shared there, and I think many of the ideas Philip shared, I find very intriguing. I don't know if they're right. I don't know if they're wrong. Like I said, consciousness is in many ways a new and difficult field, as Philip himself talked about as well. But I just think it's all really important and worthwhile to think about. So thank you for thinking about this with me. Feel free to send any comments or thoughts my way. You can find me at Twitter at Dayton R. Martin. If you don't know how to spell that, I'll put a link in the episode description. And if you join my free weekly newsletter, you can email me back. If you like this episode, send it to a friend, post it on social media. And if you think it was worth $1 or $2, consider supporting this podcast financially on Patreon, but no pressure. Hope you have a good day.